Mount Thor is a menacing peak located on Baffin Island in the Canadian province of Nunavut. Standing at a height of 1,675 meters at its summit, Mount Thor juts out from the surrounding bedrock of the island, as its impressive appearance overshadows much of the surrounding terrain. While it certainly isn't the tallest peak I've featured on the channel, Mount Thor is renowned for its sheer western face, which features the world's largest vertical drop, with that vertical drop being 1,250 meters long. Notably, the west face of Mount Thor sports an average slope of 105 degrees, which sets it apart from the greater in overall height eastern face of Great Trango Tower, which I covered in a video a while back, which is home to the world's largest near vertical drop of 1,350 meters. Mount Thor's unique and sheer appearance is due to the result of many millions of years of seasonal glacial erosion sluicing through the neighboring Akshayuk Pass, as the granite of Mount Thor is some of the oldest stone on Earth, in sharp contrast to the Himalayas, which actually are some of the youngest mountains on Earth, a topic I covered much more in depth in my video about the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. Within the sport of mountaineering, Mount Thor is a starkly contrasting dichotomy of difficulty, as the imposing vertical western face, which was described by mountaineering legend Doug Scott as, quote, exceedingly bare of features, is extremely difficult and dangerous, and much like the aforementioned Trango Towers, an ascent of this difficulty only appeals to the most elite and hardcore participants in the sport. However, in contrast, an ascent of Mount Thor via one of the peak's ridges is considered to be more of a mid to highish level ascent, as the grade of the ridge's slopes is much gentler, and there are only a few technical pitches to circumnavigate while ascending to the summit. Due to its extremely remote Arctic location, the first ascent of Mount Thor wouldn't be completed until the year 1965, when two climbers, Lyman Spitzer and Donald Morton, ascended the peak following a route up one of the peak's ridges. However, following this first ascent, word of Mount Thor's imposing western face began to spread amongst mountaineering's elite, and the first ascent of the world's highest vertical drop became a highly sought-after accomplishment amongst the most dedicated of big wall climbers. However, it would take 2 decades following Lyman Spitzer and Donald Morton's first ascent of the peak before a successful ascent of Mount Thor's imposing western face would be completed, despite numerous attempts by many various expedition teams over the years. The feat was finally first accomplished in 1985 by a 4-man team consisting of a man named Earl Redfern, a man named Eric Brand, a man named Tom Bepler, and a man named John Bagley. The 4 men's ascent of the west face was a true test of endurance, as they battled against gravity for the entirety of the grueling 33 days they spent on the wall. Now, with both of the major first ascents of the peak completed successfully, in the years following, Mount Thor would still continue to attract top-level climbers to its western face, as they sought after other various, more difficult ascents of the face, either seeking to establish new lines or seeking to ascend the peak solo, a feat that, as of late July of 1998, had yet to be accomplished, although several solo climbers were poised to attempt their own ascents of the face over the coming weeks. By the second week of July in 1998, the big wall climbing season on Mount Thor's western face was in full swing, as 2 dedicated solo climbers would be going head-to-head in a de-facto race to the summit. American climber Jason Smith and Japanese climber Go Abe. Jason was a highly experienced big wall climber who had come up with the idea to attempt his ascent the preceding winter after he completed a difficult wintertime solo ascent of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park on Christmas Day of 1997. However, unlike Jason, this was not the Japanese climber Go Abe's first attempt at a solo ascent of the western face, as he had also spent the preceding 2 summers in 1996 and 1997 attempting to establish a difficult new line up the face. Although he had been unsuccessful with both his prior attempts, he had made significant vertical progress during his second attempt, reaching his new high point a few hundred feet above a high ledge that sits about 2/3 of the way up the wall during his attempt in 1997 before he was ultimately forced to withdraw, and thus Go was very enthusiastic about his chances of completing the ascent this time, as he had become quite familiar with over half of his planned route of ascent by this point. Jason and Go would not be alone on the wall as they attempted their ascents, however, as several expedition teams would also be attempting to ascend the face that summer, forging their own lines to the summit alongside the solo climbers. Jason got a bit of a head start on Go, setting off on his climb on July 15th, and by August 5th, he was nearing the final push of his historic climb, powering through the omnipresent risk of being struck by massive chunks of falling rock from above as he did so. Meanwhile, Go Abe had set off on his summit attempt in the final few days of July. Due to Go's staggered start, the de facto race between himself and Jason would come to a rather anticlimactic close when a few days later, Jason successfully reached the summit as Go laboriously retraced his line up the lower face from the years previous. However, this would not deter Go from continuing his ascent, as he was determined to establish his new line up the face, and over the next few weeks, he continued to forge ahead. By mid-August, Go had reached the high ledge, meaning that he had nearly reached his previous attempt's high point. While Go's line up the lower face had been a unique one, it closely followed the line of first ascent taken in 1985. However, upon reaching this ledge is where his route would become uniquely his own, as his route would continue to ascend in a relatively straight line, while other ascents had typically traversed along the ledge for a few hundred meters in order to follow the peak's more natural lines of ascent to the summit. Over the following few days, Go continued to establish his new line up the face, as he was observed by multiple other parties, slowly making his ascent to the summit on the final stretch above the high ledge. However, as he had just surpassed his previous year's high point and was drilling a new bolt into a large flake, Catastrophe would covertly strike, as a group of Czech climbers reported seeing him on the wall 1 second and then glancing back to the place where they'd last seen him, only to find no trace of him. The Czech climber's account of Abe's sudden disappearance was also mirrored by a duo of Spanish climbers who were in the process of establishing their own new line up the face, who recalled glancing down at Abe occasionally, only for him to suddenly disappear from the wall. Another team of multinational climbers who had completed a 15-day ascent of Mount Thor also reportedly returned to base camp following their ascent, only to find Abe's tent and belongings appearing long abandoned, untouched since their arrival at the peak. The 2 Spanish climbers were the first to complete their climb, and upon returning to the Canadian mainland, they alerted authorities of Go's disappearance. A few days later, The multinational expedition team would also report his disappearance as authorities assembled a coalition of elite rescue climbers to search for Go. Due to Mount Thor's extremely remote location on an island in the Arctic, it would take search teams almost 2 weeks to arrive at the peak, where they found Go's tent still mostly assembled and appearing long since abandoned. Instead of ascending the western face to search for him, a process that could take several more weeks, search teams instead opted to rappel down the face from the summit, as they reasoned, due to his last reported position by the other climbers, it was likely that if he had fallen, his body would have landed on the upper ledge. Their hunch would turn out to be correct, as they located Abe's lifeless body lying on the upper ridge. They found that his rope had been cut, and his body lay atop what appeared to be a large cluster of rockfall debris. Upon inspecting the line up the face that he had been following, they found evidence that Abe had been drilling a bolt into a large flake on the face, which, it turned out, had not been as sturdy as he had initially thought, and broke free from the face. Subsequently, this had caused him to fall from the wall. Initially, it was suspected that the broken flake had severed Go's line. However, upon closer inspection of his equipment and of the route he had been following, the evidence seemed to suggest that his rope had likely instead been severed due to the fall itself, which, they reasoned as he fell, had been caught on another flake's sharp edge, and as his weight dropped down onto his ropes, he swung forwards towards the wall, in turn causing the rope to shear, sending him plummeting to his death on the ledge below him. Thank you all for watching.